those every day.
Oh, okay. So now it's healing all normal life? Okay.
Jack Bullard. Big board. Hey, Steve, Christian. Oh, okay. But so you weren't able to like a shift supervisor, CRW. Oh, okay. And I think it's back in the 70s. Yeah, I'm glad it didn't come in like that. And Jack and Steve and several others were great. Think about it. All the kids that Steve at lunchtime was down Jack's house, and mine was going to the first.
What's up, Mark? Oh, so pretty much after you got up, after your morning nap, then you just kept working all day. Good night. Well, if you fall asleep, I understand. David might not. Okay, good evening, everyone. Glad to see everybody with us this evening. I hope you're enjoying at least the mild heat wave and or cold wave, depending on where you are. Weather's been somewhat okay. It's going to rain the next few days, but it's been a good week regardless. This evening we're continuing in Genesis 19. We're going to continue our discussion looking at the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah and look at a kind of a deeper application of how we can look at that destruction from the Deuteronomy standpoint. But we'll talk about that here in just a moment. We'll ask Brother Philip. I know it's not on the list. Can you lead us in opening prayer? Amen. Thank you. As we began looking through Genesis 19, we started looking at kind of the beginning of the end, so to speak. As we kind of talked about Abraham pleading with God over Sodom and Gomorrah, and more than likely because of Lot and his family, we find that chapter 18 kind of ends on a cliffhanger of sorts. God goes on his way, Abraham goes on his own. And in chapter 19, we're introduced to Lot as he's waiting at the gates, and he welcomes in these two visitors, the two of the three people who came and visited Abraham, which the Bible would call them angels. Based off the interaction between Lot taking care of these two angels, we find out that the men of Sodom and Gomorrah desired to basically commit wicked atrocities with these two men, but the angels will not have it. And in the midst of this confusion where we find the two angels leading Lot and his family out of the land of Sodom, or at least the city of Sodom, there's a couple of things that go down. As we looked at last week, looking at some of the things that we can learn from Lot through God's judgment, it's because of Lot's righteousness, as per 2 Peter, that would teach us that him and his family were delivered, at least for the most part. Righteousness will take you only so far unless you choose not to be righteous. which we see from Lot's wife. There's different lessons we can learn in light of how we work through family relationships. What happens if we desire to be righteous, but then someone in our family desires not to be? How does God work through that? Well, that's God. He's the one who can work through all those very complex emotions, and oftentimes if I'm emotionally charged, I won't think correctly. But beyond that, maybe some of the interactions we find between how we try to work with our family members who aren't God-fearing and or they don't want to think about spiritual matters. How do we work through that? Well, Sodom and Gomorrah, looking at Lot's perspective and his righteousness, is an example of that. But I do want us to look at something as we also consider the scope of God's wrath. As we go through this text, there's actually a couple of things that come up when we talk about the nature of God's justice and judgment. When you consider the destruction that comes upon Sodom and Gomorrah, it is considered, when we're first introduced to the city, a wicked city. In chapter 13, when Lot and Abraham would divide the land, we would find out that it would say that the land looked beautiful, but the men in Sodom and Gomorrah were exceedingly wicked. So just because it had the appearance of looking great, internally it's not so great. You tend to see people who, quote unquote, are rich, people who have a lot of property. Maybe they are, physically speaking. But if we could look at their heart, I wonder if they would look as attractive to us as God sees them. And that's what we're going to find out through Sodom and Gomorrah. Some of the characteristics we find as we go through the city, as we look at the scope of Sodom and Gomorrah's destruction, I want you to notice through the text whom God excluded and whom God included. I want you to notice in verse 4, or really this should be, chapter 19, verse 4. It would say that the men of Sodom, both old and young, all the people of every quarter, surrounded the house. When the destruction came upon Sodom and Gomorrah, there was no respecter of age, whether you were just starting life or you were ending life. If you were in the city, you were going to be destroyed. I want you to notice in verse number 11 that we find that the individuals who were struck with blindness, it would say that the angels struck the men who were at the doorway of the house with blindness, both small and great. It doesn't matter about physical stature and or athleticism or any kind of dexterity of sorts. In fact, it didn't even matter if you were intelligent or you were just not. We'll just say that. You were intelligent or not. The scope of God's judgment still came on all. In fact, you consider verse number 4, 12, and 14 when the angels would say, do you have any sons? Do you have any daughters? Any daughters-in-law? Judgment of God on Sodom and Gomorrah fell on both male and female. So it didn't matter about age. It didn't matter about ability. It didn't matter about intellect. It didn't matter about gender. In fact, what's interesting, in verse number 12, notice the statement the angels would say. Have you anyone else here, son-in-law, your sons, your daughters, and whomever you have in the city, take them out of this place? Look down in verse number 14. So Lot went out and spoke to his sons-in-law, who had married his daughters, and said, get up out of this place, for the Lord will destroy this city. Look down in verse number 15. When the morning dawned, the angels urged Lot to hurry, saying, arise, take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, lest you be consumed in the punishment of the city. Verse number 16. As he lingered, the men took hold of his hand, his wife's hand, and the hand of his 2 daughters, and the Lord, being merciful to him, brought him out and set him, notice location, outside of the city. Anyone who was found within this place called the city of sin, the city where God says that's where my destruction is going to lie, that's where it's going to be found. That's where people perish. So consider this. The scope of destruction here didn't matter about age. It didn't matter about athletic ability. It didn't matter about athleticism or intellect. It didn't matter about gender. What mattered is you're either in this city or you're not. Now I want you to consider from an eternal perspective. You're either right with God or you're not. God doesn't make a mistake in eternal judgment. You ever considered that? Ever considered in light of the life that we live in, that God says there are certain places you ought not be, and there's a place you ought to be? In fact, consider your own relationship with God. Do you know whether or not you're where you need to be? Are you in the city called sin, or are you in the place called the light? Walking in the light as He is in the light. You see, God has made a distinction. He shouldn't have to pull us out of sin, even though He does. You consider Luke chapter 15, parable of the lost sheep. You've got a sheep who has gone away from the 99, talking about one who was okay, but he decided to go away. We got the parable of the prodigal son in the following chapter, or toward the end of that chapter, going into 16. Well, that was a parable of someone who had it made. They went away, and then they realized when they came to their senses, it would say when he had come to himself, he said, man, even the servants in my father's house have it made. Surely I can go back and plead with my father. Well, God is always pleading for the lost to come back. But if we're not careful, we might become comfortable living in the place called sin. In fact, have you ever thought about that maybe in light of who you would consider to be your enemies? People who are out to get you, people who you think about and you just have negative feelings towards. Have you ever had bad feelings towards yourself? Like, have you ever said to yourself, why did I do this to me? What was I thinking? I have put myself in this position. Have you considered oftentimes if we refuse to be honest with how we're treating ourselves and where we take ourselves, that maybe on Judgment Day, God will take a mirror and say, this is who you need to be angry at. It's not me. Oftentimes, there are places we want to go, but God says, do not go in that city. There's an old sermon the old-timers would preach that would talk about where Lot pitched his tent. And it comes from Genesis 13, and it feeds off of what we find in Genesis 19. Just because something looks good, talking about financial gains, just because a certain career choice looks good, or maybe there's a job opportunity that would just fix everything. Maybe there's a certain relationship, you really like someone, but if you go through that relationship, it is going to pull you away from God. Is it really worth going into that city in regards to your relationship with God? That's something we got to take seriously, and something that, if we're not careful, God may have to lead us through the emotional turmoil just to show us mercy, to lead us out of that place. You ever wondered if, well, we'll just ask it this way. Is God the reason for your problems in life, like when things get really complex and confusing? No, He never is. Job 36 and 37 would say that He is no respecter of persons. The judge who judges righteously never perverts judgment in the judgment of both the righteous and the wicked. I think oftentimes we tend to put more on God than God says you need to look at yourself. And if we're not careful, we become involved in this city of sin. And if we do, we need to be mindful that we're going to be held accountable and in the same kind of judgment and condemnation, no better than everybody else who is apart from God on the day of judgment. So maybe God does call us out today, or maybe He is calling you out today. He's calling you out, but He's pleading with you. Get out of the city. Go to the place where you need to be. Now, narrative speaking, Lot is getting out of the city, his daughters are getting out of the city, and the angels are leading them through the city, and this is where we get to an interesting point in the text. Not one time in this text do I find Lot ever stopping to pray and say, oh Lord, please give me a little bit more time. And Lord, while we're being delivered, I want you to deliver other people around us. I don't see that. But because the Bible calls Lot a righteous man, I want you to see that even in a moment of danger in his life, that Lot actually provides a wonderful gift for the people he's around. Now watch this very carefully. When you look at verse number 18, the angels have already made it clear you need to escape for your life. The destruction of God is going to come upon this place. In fact, he would even say, Lot, in thinking about this, verse 18, please know, my lords, indeed now, if your servant has found favor in your sight, and you have increased your mercy, which you have shown me by saving my life, I cannot escape to the mountains, lest some evil overtake me and I die. See now, this city is near enough to me to flee to. Is it not a little one? Please, let me escape there. Is it not a little one? And my soul shall live. And the angel said to Lot, See, I have favored you concerning this thing also, and that I will not overthrow this city. Now look at this, which you have spoken. Hurry and escape there, for I cannot do anything until you arrive there. You know, there's a thought, if you look back into some of the cases of 9/11, like there might be like a businessman who, for some reason, he missed his train that morning, or someone called in sick that morning, and then you got the events of 9/11 go through, and people who are interviewing these people who weren't in the building, who should have been in the building, would say, well, God was looking over me. Well, I can't prove that, and I can't disprove that at the same time. It's just a claim. But have you ever thought about that maybe God keeps bad things from happening because you are where you are, and He's waiting for you to escape the place where God's wrath is going to be? You know, eternally speaking, it could be the case that maybe you're keeping your family out of trouble because of who you are. That shouldn't mean that you shouldn't try to influence your family, but when I think about God holding off His wrath, I wonder if He's waiting just one more day because He knows who you're working with. He knows who you're talking to. He knows who you possibly can influence, and He's keeping His wrath at bay because you're simply there. Now, why would God do that? Well, I think in one case, He loves you. The Bible teaches us that. But also another powerful incident. I want you to look at 2 Peter chapter 3. 2 Peter chapter 3 and verse... let's start. I'm in 1 Peter. No wonder that looks wrong. Verse number 3. It would say, knowing this first, that scoffers will come in the last days, walking in their own lust, saying, where is the promise of God's coming? For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the creation, or the beginning of creation. For this they willfully forget. Now, if anybody tells you I can live however I want to, and you're trying to lead them to the Lord, do understand that when you bring up the idea of eternal judgment, they don't want to think about that. Why would they not want to think about eternal judgment? Could be called out on it. Do you think children enjoy the fact when they know they're going to get in trouble? Do you think they enjoy thinking about the fact of the pain that's going to come through that discipline? Nobody likes being called out. In fact, when they know for a fact that they're guilty, they will try to make every possible excuse not to think about that. This they willfully forget. That by the word of God, the heavens were of old, and the earth was standing out of water and in the water, by which the world that then existed perished, being flooded with water. But the heavens and the earth, which are now preserved by that same word, are reserved for fire until the day of judgment and perdition of ungodly men. But, beloved, do not forget this one thing, that with the Lord 1 day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is 1 day. Time is irrelevant to God. But this is not about God. This is about those who mock that God's going to judge the world one day. But also, notice again the beginning of verse number 8. It's also to remind us, those who are loved by God. Verse number 9. The Lord is not slack concerning His promise, as some count slackness, but is long-suffering toward who? Us. Why is He long-suffering towards us? What's that next phrase say? He's not willing that any should perish. Have you thought about maybe God hasn't ended the world because you have a job before you? You have some work to do. Maybe He's waiting to come back to see how you do on that mission. Now, He already knows the end. He's all-knowing. He is outside of time. In fact, that's just a whole nother conversation by itself. But have you ever considered, maybe you are the one who is standing between your family and God's wrath. Now, I understand Jesus is the one who ultimately can stand between them and God, but Jesus is in heaven. You are a member of His body. And the labor before you, there's a great day coming, but maybe God's waiting to allow you some time to work. Praise be to God that He gives us the ability to do those things and show mercy as He has shown mercy to us and allowed us to receive forgiveness. Praise be to God that He allows us to show God's mercy to others because they need that kind of mercy. Now, here's another thought. Are you actually praying to God over showing mercy to those people? See, Lot doesn't even ask for that. All he says was, please let me escape to this city. In fact, he even says multiple times, there is a little city. Is it not a little one? And even in the text, it would say, is it not a little one? It's almost like the writer of Genesis is saying, man, that's a tiny town. That's a tiny town. But I want you to notice this. When you look at some of the words that play through this text, the first word we find that is of importance is the first word of favor and or mercy. If I have found favor in your sight. Favor, twice we see in the text. Also we see this idea of not just mercy, but the idea of saving me. So there's grace that's shown to your servant. There's mercy that's shown to your servant. And when grace and mercy are shown to someone, guess what happens as a result? They're saved. There's salvation provided. What's Lot trying to be saved from? God's wrath. And it's not just him, it's his family too. Did you know that if you have God's mercy but you don't have His grace, there's no salvation? Did you know that if you have His grace but you do not have His mercy, there is no salvation? According to Proverbs 16:6, where mercy and truth abound, atonement is provided for the soul. Ephesians 2, verse 8 and 9, for by grace, God's favor, you have been saved through faith. So something God instructs me through His mercy, through His word, gives me grace from God. Romans would tell me that's where the righteousness of God is found, within His word, but it's the righteousness of God that has the power of salvation. This is an example. If we don't have both of those together, I cannot be saved. One cannot praise God for His grace, despise His mercy, and be saved. One cannot be grateful for His mercy, despise His grace. In other words, follow His teachings and consider themselves saved. You got to have both. If you don't have both, you can't be saved. Don't thank God for being a gracious God, fail to find His mercy, and then wonder what happened. In fact, consider this. Have we talked about the idea of I have desired mercy and not sacrifice in here recently? No? Okay, get this. From the beginning of creation, I know, and we're not talking about what God foreknew, because we could go through Ephesians and Romans and see that God foreknew that man would sin. God foreknew that there would need to be a Redeemer. God foreknew that there would need to be a place where the remnant would be. But do you think God's ultimate design was that He had always intended the creation He made to always follow Him faithfully? Now, if God even had the thought to create you, what is He displaying in creating you? What part of His character is He showing you just by allowing you the chance to live? It's going to be one of these three words. Mercy. I desire mercy. I never wanted sacrifice to be what your dependency on, but be grateful for my mercy that I even allow you to live. That's what Jesus was thankful for. Thank you for your mercy. Jesus is the only one who showed what a life that ultimately depends not just on God's grace, a life that is lived by grace, but also a life that is thankful and grateful and exemplifies through His choices God's mercy. It is because of the Lord's mercies, Lamentations 3, we are not consumed. It is because of the Lord's mercies that we even live and exist and breathe and have a chance to live eternally with Him. That's all mercy. It's not grace. In fact, as you look through this text, continuing with the idea of mercy, there is a city that Lot goes to, and it would say in verse number 22, hurry and escape there, for I cannot do anything until you arrive there. The name of that city is called Zoar. Now, back in verse number 20, it would say there is a little city. Some translations have, there is an insignificant city. But I want you to think about this. Was Zoar, was that even going to face the destruction of God? I want you to look at something really important. Let's go back to Genesis 14. I want you to look at verse 2. So this is the battle of the 9 kings. You got the Assyrian kings versus the kings that are in this region that is called the plains of Sodom. Listen to the names of the 5 kings. This is Genesis 14, verse 2. They made war with Bera, king of Sodom, Bersha, the king of Gomorrah, Shinab, king of Admah, Shemeber, king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is, get this, Zoar. All these joined together in the valley of Sodom, that is, the Salt Sea. Now, most of the time people read through this and they always talk about the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, Sodom and Gomorrah, Sodom and Gomorrah. I want you to look at Deuteronomy 29. And I want you to notice Moses is actually going to give us a continuation of this account. And he's going to give us a full picture of the scope of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Deuteronomy 29, let's begin in verse 20. So they're renewing the covenant in Moab, and he's talked about here's the law of the Lord, here's the blessings if you follow, but then what happens if God's people choose not to follow him? Notice in verse number 20, Deuteronomy 29. The Lord would not spare him, for the anger of the Lord and his jealousy would burn against that man, and every curse that is written in this book would settle on him. And the Lord would blot his name out from under heaven, and the Lord would separate him from all the tribes of Israel for adversity, according to the curses of the covenant that are written in this book of the law, so that the coming generation of your children who rise up after you, and the foreigner who comes from a far land would say, when they see the plagues of that land and its sicknesses when the Lord is laid on it, what are they going to say when they see the children of Israel, if they ever choose to step away from God, God punishes them? Notice how they describe it. The whole land is brimstone, salt, burning. Sound like destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah? It is not sown, nor does it bear, nor does any grass grow there, like the overthrow of Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, which the Lord overthrew in his anger and his wrath. What city is missing from that list? Zoar. Who was in Zoar? Lot. I want you to think about the impact that Lot had just because he was there. 5 cities were in the plain that were to be destroyed. One man said to the Lord, can I flee to this city and stay alive? Do you know what one righteous man did? For the behalf of an entire city that is called insignificant, and all their lives were spared because that man was there. Does that sound like an insignificant city to you? Could you imagine a man coming from heaven? Well, actually, no, God coming from heaven himself in the form of a man. And he gives you the offer of an eternal lifetime. And he says, hey, look, I know you're going to do some bad things in your life. I know you're not going to want to, but you're going to do it anyways. And you're not going to be thinking half the time. Sometimes you're just going to do it because you feel like that's what you need to do. And here's the agreement I'll make with you. I will die on your behalf so that from the divine perspective, you can receive forgiveness of your sins through my life. I want you to have a place where there is no pain, there's no discomfort, everything that is absolutely beautiful, and then some, that not just this world can provide, but even what is even greater than this world can provide can be found in that place. I am willing to offer you my life for yours. Does that sound like an insignificant deal to you? If one righteous man can make an eternal difference for your life, don't ever doubt the power of God and His Word working through your life towards others. When you feel like you're absolutely nothing, but you still can save at least one soul, that's a big deal. In fact, it's even more than that. It does more than just affect their entire world. It affects their entire eternity. So is what Lot did an insignificant act? No. You have no idea the impact of your actions and your choices, and even just the lesson of just simply being there can change someone's life forever. It can change a whole community forever. Now, what's of interest beyond this is that when you look at, let me make sure I got this. Well, those are some of the other verses. When we consider Jesus as the one who paid the price for us, we really shouldn't take His sacrifice for us as an insignificant thing. But I want you to consider something as a sidebar before we move to the strange ending of this chapter. Do you find yourself living life sometimes that treats the sacrifice of Jesus like an insignificant thing? You see, it forces me to have to reevaluate my thoughts and my decisions and my actions. Because if I'm not careful, I might find myself being pulled back into that city that God says, you get far away from that. And even though my life may not seem like something now, I know there's an even greater city on the horizon because of at least one man who loved me and died for me, lived righteously before God, so that I can be in a place that is far beyond insignificant. So consider how you live, how you act, before you make decisions. Are you in the place God wants you to be? And are you aware of the power of the gospel in your life and how it can affect others when it feels like it's just not? Galatians 6 verse 9 is a very powerful verse. Let us not lose heart or grow weary in doing well, for we shall reap in due season if we do not faint. In other words, if I lose heart because, well, everything that I do, nothing good is coming out of this, well, when you plant a seed in the ground, I know just about all of us can relate to that. All of us can. When you plant a seed in the ground, have you ever seen a seed where you just plant it and you put a little bit of water on it and boom, there's the plant right there? I've only seen it happen one time. It's when I bought the plant already fully grown, and when I put it in the ground, bam, there was already fruit right there. It normally don't work that way. When you have a seed, you got to give it time. Vegetables tend to come up much faster than fruit trees do. But also the works that we do for the Lord. Some things we do are going to be like vegetables. Some things we do are going to be more like fruits. But last time I read my Bible, it doesn't say you can know a tree by its vegetables. It says you can know a tree by its fruits, which tells me the things I do for God are going to take a little bit of time. And some things may even take a lifetime. I love the story that Philip told a while back where he talked about a man who had never obeyed the gospel all of his life. And it wasn't until his latter years, when he got in his 80s or 90s, that he decided to obey the gospel. And he died a few days after obeying the gospel. You know, when you think of the parable of the vineyard workers, it would talk about that there are people who come into the laboring fields in the 11th hour. Now, that's not talking about the fact that his entire lifetime he could have influenced people to Jesus. That's beyond the point. God offers the invitation to become His, even in the final moments of life. And we need to be thankful to God that He allows people that opportunity, because if He didn't, good night. There's many times I've always asked God for an extension, a grace period, so to speak, and say, forgive me. But I pray that I never ask later than the 11th hour, because then by that time it's way too late. But praise be to God for people who do find Him, whether it's in the 1st, 3rd, 6th, 9th, 11th hour. Philip, you had a comment? Oh, I thought you raised your hand. Okay, so with this in mind, I want you to think about this before we read the ending of this text, because this just gets weird beyond Lot and his family being spared. If you have gone through a catastrophe where the land you just came out of is on its smoke, you have no contact with anyone else. I mean, this is before cell signal, So they didn't have phone, they didn't have Facebook, they didn't have the local marketplace, so to speak. They didn't have any of that. If you just came out of a town that is completely consumed by smoke and that is all that you see everywhere, what do you presume may have just happened, but you escaped? The world has ended. Everything's smoke. I can't see beyond the smoke. The world is over. Now, if you're in Lot's perspective, he's hanging out there in Zoar, and it's been less than a day, and you're the overcautious father, like fathers would be. You've got your children there. You just lost your wife in this ordeal, and you're a stranger in this town. What do you think people are going to start doing very soon if you stick around in that town too long? They're going to start asking questions. Hey, neighbor, where'd you come from? Well, what's he going to say? I just came from Sodom and Gomorrah. Oh, really? I have family over there. How did you get out of Dodge? Well, he tried to avoid the questions before the questions arose. Now, with that in mind, people thinking that it may have been the end of the world, I want you to notice the statements from Lot's daughters. I have no idea where the mentality or the mental state of Lot is in this, other than he's out of his mind for some of this. But the statements that the two daughters make are they're not justified thoughts, but they're thinking. Maybe God has reset everything like the flood. And there are no more men, which makes me ask the question, were there no men in Zoar? I don't know, it's just weird. But notice what they would say. It would say, verse 30, that Lot went up out of Zoar and dwelt in the mountains, and his two daughters were with him, for he was afraid to dwell in Zoar, for good reason. People asking questions. And he and his daughters dwelt in a cave. Now the firstborn said to the younger, our father is old, and there is no man on the earth to come to us, as is the custom of all the earth. Normally it's, I guess it depends. If you go back to your dating days, there were probably some people you thought of growing up where the thought occurred to your mind, they will never go on a date with me, even if I were the last person on earth. They're just out of my league. What would drive a daughter to say, there are no more men in the earth? They think it's the end of the world. There are no more men here. After everything they've gone through, what are we to do? We are restarting creation. While that is not the correct statement, it is because of the reality of what they're thinking is the reality. I'm not going to go through that. This does demonstrate a powerful example of choices we might make through emotional stimulus without logical reasoning. I can feel like God is somewhere or God is involved with something if I really, 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 really want what I'm feeling or what's going on. If I really want that to happen, it's much easier for me to say, well, God wants this. Well, as a child of God, let's just run through. Everybody caught your hands. You had your hands in the cookie jar. You decide to get a lottery ticket, and it's the Mega Millions, and it is getting up there close to $1 billion, and lo and behold, you say, nah, it's just one ticket, and you got the winning numbers, and you turn it in. Oh man, everybody's going to know. Everybody's going to know. Are you going to take that money? Or are you going to tear up the ticket? You see, emotional stimulus does not equal rational reasoning from God. Someone can tell me with all emotional pleading that my house is on fire, which I know is a lie because I don't technically have one. I have an apartment, so I'd be a little concerned if they meant the apartment complex is on fire. But just because they plead and they beg, please believe that this is on fire, and I choose to believe them, and I go to the place I live and it's not on fire, emotional reasoning does not equal rational thinking. Someone can get caught up in the emotional state. If you look at non-denominational, what they call themselves. Honestly, they're more of a Baptist/Methodist combination, but they call themselves like a network faith type fellowship, which is still against the Bible because they practice things that aren't biblical. There's a lot of feelings and emotion and a lot of heart rilings in those places. You know, there was a time when even God's people would have an emotional response towards God, and they would cry unto God, and God would say, I will not hear them. You want to see an emotional disbelief? Look at when God told Israel in Numbers 13 and 14, you're not going into the land. And there was a people who said, oh, no, we were just kidding. We didn't actually mean those things. We believe you now. And they go up that mountain and they get defeated by the enemies. Because of emotionalism, they fail to acknowledge the reality of their choices. That's what Lot daughters are emphasizing. You can think that is the case, but that doesn't mean that's the reality you live in. Yes?
Why do you think that Lot asked the angel to go so far, but then he didn't go there? He went to the mountains because he was afraid.
Well, he did in the destruction, because it would say that when he arrived in the city, verse 22, if it said, I cannot do anything until you arrive there. Verse 23, the sun had risen up on the earth when Lot entered Zoar. So he did go to the city. He didn't stay in the city, though.
Yeah, I mean, why would he care? Why would he leave for the city to be there and he wouldn't want to live there?
So if you're, well, I have a thought. It's not saying it's the answer. Besides the thought of if we stay here, people are going to ask questions. If you're caught up in the emotional turmoil of everything that's going on, just lost your wife, you have your two daughters with you, you've got this destruction that's going on there. I don't even know if they were looking towards Sodom and Gomorrah, but they were definitely somewhere in the city. It could just be the case. I just lost my thought. Ask the question again. Why did Lot? Oh, okay, I remember. So you know how if you're in danger mode and technically you can make it further than what you think you can make, you're just not sure because you're just, everything's going chaotic. You just need to get somewhere that's safe. It could just be in the moment that he was thinking we can't even go further than that before you destroy us or destroy the plains, which he could have. But what if oftentimes God knows that we can make it further than we give ourselves credit for? So oftentimes, I find myself times doing this. I make excuse why I can't go further than what I actually can, but God knows I can. But in His mercy towards me, when I'm giving an excuse, there's that learning process where I've got to see, no, I'm capable of more than what I give myself credit for. It could be that. I don't know.
You got there and realized they're just as wicked.
Well, it could have been that too. That's possible. That's possible. Huh? Well, it doesn't say that they didn't have any provisions when they made their journey. Or they could have picked up something in Zoar. Well, hey, mister, I've never seen you in town before. What you doing? I just want to buy this and I'm out. I don't know. Huh? Well, they must have been muscular girls or something. I don't know. Well, actually, I think all the people in the Old Testament probably could outwork us just because they worked outside and did physical labor all the time. But that's just my thought. You got World War II people, but then you got Old Testament people. I think they're brutes. But they're kind brutes. But I don't know. It's a good question. I just lost my thought.
Any indication how long transpired between those events?
Which ones?
When they left Zoar and then whenever his wife got drunk.
Well, that part never happened because his wife was gone.
I mean, his daughter was
So it would say, verse 23, when the sun had risen up on the earth, so that's that morning. And then it would say, after God had overthrown the cities, that Lot went up in the mountains. So it doesn't really give a time frame there, but it does say on that night, when the incident went down with the firstborn, verse 34, it happened on the next day that the firstborn said to the younger, indeed, you can do the same thing. So it seems like a short turnaround time. It's not long enough for people to start asking questions. So whatever that time might be, I don't know. But I do think this is interesting as well. You know, I mentioned Lamentations chapter 3, which would talk about, I think it's like verse 19, 20, 21, is because of the Lord's mercies we are not consumed. They are new every morning. I think it is not a mistake that the Holy Spirit decided the beginning of verse 23, when the sun had risen upon the earth, when Lot entered Zoar, then the Lord rained brimstone and fire on Sodom and Gomorrah from the Lord out of the heavens. I think that is also a physical display of mercy, is what's under consideration here. So when you look at Genesis 19, most people think about judgment of God. But I want you to think about what God saves the righteous from when he does throw his wrath upon the ungodly. We should be reminded constantly, it is because of his mercy we are not consumed. So maybe next time you read this, look at this after you read it, say a prayer to God and thank him for the life he's given you now and the life he has promised you then. Next week, Lord willing, we're going to be looking at Genesis 20, and we'll be looking at an agreement, kind of a similar story we read back in chapter 12, but it's going to be introducing a character who's going to influence Isaac's life by the name of Abimelech. So I thank you for your time and attention. We'll be back here in just a few moments.